She is a sinner. This summer, as I said, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the people I've encountered over the years. Some of the hurting, wounded young people that God's given me the privilege to connect with. Many of them remind me of Jesus' ministry and the people that he met. And they are like so many people that we encounter in our lives that we may not know it. So I want us to learn how to respond to the people that we encounter, these needy, wounded, sinful people. Not like the Pharisee who condemned the woman as a sinner, but rather as Jesus, who loved and accepted her. A number of years ago, I began working with a young lady at the school who was having significant difficulties in school. She had a learning disability and found school very hard. It made her, even at young ages, feel stupid when she couldn't keep up with the other students. They would get done with her work and she was still struggling. Adding to this, she grew up in a home where she was ridiculed and shamed repeatedly. Her mother had emotional difficulties and was very much up and down, and the man that her mother lived with was harsh, uncaring, critical, and at times mean and demeaning. This girl struggled with her self-worth. She didn't think she was valuable. She didn't think she was lovable. She didn't know whether anybody loved her. She expected to be rejected. And it was out of this mixture of emotions that you can say that she went looking for love in all the wrong places and in all the wrong ways. She longed to know that she was loved and unfortunately used her body to attain it. It failed every time. Quite literally, almost weekly, she would come in and talk about a new boy she had begun to date. And this would not last long, leaving her again feeling rejected and more ashamed, and seemed to affirm all those adjectives that others had put upon her. If she had met the Pharisee in Jesus' story, that man would have labeled her a sinner. Maybe the most profound moment that really told me what she was looking for came when she was able to finally get the credits necessary to graduate. It was by the thinnest margin, by the skin of her teeth, you might say. It was her senior year. It was the last semester. It was during finals week. And everything depended upon how well she did on her finals. And finally, she got word that she had done well enough on her finals to graduate. And so like I do with each of the graduating seniors, I was able to give her a Bible. And chills come when I think about her reaction of just, not just joy, but this sense that I cared. She gave me an innocent hug, and that was not something she was comfortable with at all. But it told me how much she just longed for somebody in her life to tell her that she was lovable. Quite honestly, it is far too easy for us to look at the behaviors of certain people like this young lady and assume the worst. To think of them as sinners. We judge them by their appearances, and we never really get to know them and the story that led them to the place that they are. And this is exactly what happens in the story that I read to you a few moments ago. Most of the people at the dinner saw only one thing when this woman showed up. But as we will see, Jesus saw this woman in a totally different light. The choice we have to make is, how will we see people like this? Will we see them as Jesus or as the Pharisee? But remember, the myopic, nearsighted vision of the Pharisee also made it impossible for him to welcome Jesus into his life. It's an important point. Let's examine the count. There are two main characters, other than Jesus, who we clearly know in this story. You have the Pharisee. Here is a religious man. He's of the sect of the Pharisees. They were very strict. These men had high moral standards and honestly really tried to live up to the reputation. These were not hypocritical men. We may not appreciate how they treated sinful people, but they tried in their own way to live according to their rules. They believed God expected them to live obediently. They had studied Jewish history and saw how often sin had led to the destruction of the nation. They were stringent that if God is going to be honored, if we're going to be blessed, we have to live this way. We have to live as holy and obedient. We must put sin away. We can't compromise. And then we have the sinful woman. We're not told why this woman is called that, but we can assume from the reactions of the men and the religious leader. I think she had very similar experiences to the young woman that I talked about. She looked for love and found nothing but shame. And I think that assumption becomes more credible as we follow the story. Again, the third character needs no introduction, Jesus. So the Pharisee invites Jesus to come and dine with him. On the surface, this seems to be a genuine act of hospitality that one religious leader would expect from another. But as we see, not everything is as it seems. The other person, the woman, shows up also. But she wasn't invited. Well, maybe that's a little inaccurate. We might say there was an implied invitation to Jesus, or the invitation to Jesus implied the invitation to this woman. You can only imagine what this woman was setting herself up for to show up at this place. Hosted by a prominent Pharisee with all the other religious leaders around, how much ridicule had she already taken from them? If nothing else, she's going to get very uncomfortable stares from them and snickers and sneers. It was possible she would face outright rejection. But something, and we can suggest something about Jesus, something that Jesus did, compels her to come. We are given no clues about this. It's clear that somewhere she had encountered Jesus or heard something about Jesus that said, maybe here is a place I will find acceptance and forgiveness. And maybe even someone who actually loves me for me. That she would find in Jesus someone who loved her in the way that she was longing to be loved. But immediately after the invitation, she shows up, and now there's the scandal. The woman comes into the home, and if you remember in that day, they didn't sit in chairs. They reclined. They were on the floor, laid out, maybe on an elbow, on a pillow. And there, this woman comes behind Jesus. And she begins to weep. I mean, let's be honest. Having that unclean woman in the house was an offense. But then she begins to weep, and the tears fall on Jesus' feet. According to Jewish law, her touching Jesus with this brings her uncleanness upon him. So they're expecting him to say, "Get out, you're a sinful woman." But instead of rebuking her and sending her away, Jesus not only allows her to stay, but allows her to wipe the tears off his feet with her hair, and anoint his feet and kiss his feet. If this were in modern times, you can imagine the scandalous headlines the next year. Prominent religious leader accepts the advances of a prostitute. Jesus, the purported Messiah, accepts gifts and affections from a loose woman. But without the headlines, the men at this banquet are shocked and offended, and particularly the Pharisee who invited him. He contemplates what this means about Jesus. And in his mind, he contemplates. They call him a prophet, and he doesn't even recognize what kind of woman this is. It never ever occurs to him that Jesus might know exactly who she is and still accept her and accept all these gifts from her. It might even be more shocking to him to know that Jesus knew and welcomed these acts of love and gratefulness, even though of who she was. So then we see the parable. Very interesting little story here. It's interesting, too, that the man is thinking in his head about Jesus, and it says in Scripture, Jesus answered him. He knew what he was thinking, literally. So Jesus tells him this very simple story about a rich man who has hundreds of cattle and sheep, and a poor man who has one little lamb that he's taken and he's cared for. And yet when a guest comes to the rich man's house, the rich man takes the one lamb of the poor man and uses it for dinner. We go back. I'm sorry, I just told you the story that Nathan tells to David. We'll come back to Jesus' parable, but since I've told you that, because I see a parallel here. The Pharisee doesn't know what's coming. And when David is told this story about the man with all kinds of sheep and taking the one little ewe lamb, he is not anticipating that the prophet is about to say to him, "You are the man." Bold Nathan comes at the request of God and challenges David because he had Uriah killed so that he who impregnated Uriah's wife could get away with it. But the parable is told in such a way that there's no way that David knows what's coming until Nathan says, "You are the man." And now coming back forward in time to Jesus, he turns to the Pharisee and says, "Let me tell you a story." So as this Pharisee's thinking about what kind of man he is, Jesus answered him, but the Pharisee doesn't know that he's answering him, and says, "Let me tell you about two debtors. One owed 50 denarii, the other 500. Neither could pay it back. And the creditor forgives them both." And Jesus says, "Who do you think forgives most?" And the religious leader makes the obvious example. The one who is forgiven more. That makes much more sense. But he doesn't know that he is the target of this parable. He can't even conceive that he's in the same category as this woman, that he in any way needs to have his debt forgiven. As I said, this is very similar to that story of David. Wonder if the Pharisee, when he figures this out, gets angry like David did. Unfortunately for him, or I should say fortunately for David, when he was confronted, took his anger and confessed his sin. We don't see that with this man. So the religious leader answers Jesus. Obviously, the man who is forgiven much. And again, Jesus does exactly what Nathan does. He turns and says, "Do you see this woman? She has washed and wiped my feet." Needless to say, in an unorthodox fashion, she's given the guest the expected kiss. Any scent of hospitality should come that way. And she's anointed him. And Jesus points out, all of this should have been done by the host. Jesus boldly points out to this man that you didn't do any of those things. You invited me to dinner. I'm a religious leader, but you didn't give me a kiss. You didn't wash my feet, which is what would be in any hospitable situation. You didn't anoint my head with oil. In some ways, you completely violated the laws of Jewish hospitality. She did all these, and you did none of them. We don't know why this man invited Jesus. It certainly wasn't to be hospitable. Maybe he invited him because of religious convention, or maybe he invited him because it would look good at him that he'd have this new religious teacher with him, or maybe he invited him to trip him up and see if he could catch him in doing something wrong so he could reject him. But whatever it wasn't, "Come, Jesus, I respect you." Remember I said, the attitude that rejects the woman is the one that will reject Jesus also. So then the parable comes and makes this point. Jesus turns to the woman and says, "Your sins are forgiven." Remember, the one who has been forgiven much is the most grateful. And here is this woman grateful to Jesus. In some way, she knows that her sins are forgiven. It's not her acts that make her forgiven, but it's the love that seeks forgiveness that makes her forgiven. Jesus has created the scandal they were expecting. But maybe the Pharisee, embarrassed by Jesus' blunt confrontation and condemnation of him, has nothing to say, but the others do. Who is this man to forgive sins? So in a sense, the Pharisees got what they wanted, but so did this woman. She wanted to be released from her guilt and shame. She wanted acceptance, love, and forgiveness. Her boldness pays off. She leaves the Pharisee's house with all these things. She loved well, and as a result was well loved and left with forgiveness because of the boldness of her faith. You know, there's so many contrasts in this story. The uninvited guest who's a better host than the host. The religious leader who judges but fails to hold himself accountable. Or maybe we can say we have the woman with the reputation, the Pharisee who knows the reputation and rejects her, and Jesus who knows the reputation and loves. Again, the disreputable, sinful woman who loves well. The righteous Pharisee who loves poorly. And Jesus who exhibits perfect love. Jesus who did all of this for us. Every one of us. We all are the debtors. And Jesus asks us to love well. Again, I would have you consider, Jesus couldn't be invited to the banquet without the woman showing up. I think that's a parable for us. We can't receive Jesus unless we're willing to receive the lost, the lonely, the wounded, the disreputable. That young woman that I talked about, this woman, they need our love, not our condemnation. They need our help, not us turning a cold shoulder. We are all forgiven sinners. Our debt is huge. We need to learn to love well. To love Jesus well and all those he calls us to love. Listen now to the next song.